Now, before we write a single line of code, we first need to plan this project, because this one is a little bit more complex than the other projects that we have been building. So until now, we have always simply started to code, but without much thought about the features or the architecture before writing the implementation itself. I mean, we actually did use a flowchart a couple of times, but I always simply provided that flowchart and we never did it together. So we never planned an application together. So in the real world, it's very important that you always start with a planning phase before building any project, because otherwise you're setting yourself up to a lot of confusion and problems down the road. So to avoid all that, we will now do the planning of the Mapty project together, and so then you will get a feeling of how it works. Now, there are many different ways of planning a project, but I'm going to show you my favorite process here, which works great for many small and medium-sized projects. So I always like to start out with a concept called user stories. And many companies and teams use this idea of user stories, so you will see this everywhere when you start working on a real developer job. So, a user story is basically a description of the application's functionality from the user's perspective. And then, all the user stories put together will clearly describe the functionality of the entire application. So, user stories are basically a high-level overview of the whole application, which will allow us developers to determine the exact features that we need to implement in order to make the user stories actually work as intended. Then, to visualize the different actions that a user can take and how the program reacts to these actions, we usually put all these features into a nice flowchart. And again, we actually already used flowcharts in some other applications that we built before, right? Now, once we know exactly what we're going to build, it's time to think about how we're going to build it. And this brings us to the project's architecture. And in this context, architecture simply means how we will organize our code and what JavaScript features we will use. So the project's architecture is essentially what holds all the code together. It gives us a structure in which we can then develop the application's functionality. Now, my goal here is, of course, not to turn you into a software architect. The goal of this step is simply to stop and think about how we will implement all this functionality, so all these features, before we actually do it. Because we could implement any project in 1,000 different ways. So we could have one big file with no organization at all, or we could divide everything into functions, or we could use classes, or use multiple files, or a mix of everything. The possibilities are really endless, so we have a lot of choice, and all that choice can sometimes be a problem. And so if we don't think about the architecture before writing the main part of our application, then we will probably end up with a mess of unmanageable spaghetti code. And so that's not what we want. But anyway, once we thought about the project's architecture, we are finally done with the planning step and are then ready to finally move on to the development step. And of course, this is where we're going to implement the plan that we created using JavaScript code. So, let's now plan the application that we're going to build in this section, and so basically go through these 4 steps of the planning step. And we start with the user stories. And remember, a user story is essentially a description of the application's functionality from the user's perspective. And all user stories put together provide a clear picture of the application's whole functionality. Now, there are multiple formats in which we can write user stories, but the most common one is to write sentences with this format. So, as a certain type of user, I want to perform a certain action so that I can get a certain benefit. And so this format of the user story answers the question who, what, and why. Great. And so now applying this to our own MapT project, the first user story could go something like this. So as a user, I want to log my running workouts with location, distance, time, pace, and steps per minute, so that I can keep a log of all my running. So if we analyze this sentence, then this clearly tells us who wants to perform which action and why. And then, based on this, we will be able to plan the application's necessary features in the next step so that this user story can basically be satisfied. Next up, we can also say that as a user, I want to log my cycling workouts with location, distance, time, speed, and elevation gain, so I can keep a log of all my cycling. So this is similar to the first one, but this one is regarding cycling rather than running. Next up, as a user, I want to see all my workouts at a glance so I can easily track my progress over time. Then, as a user, I also want to see all my workouts on a map so I can easily check where I work out the most. And finally, the last user story, which makes sense for this application, is that as a user, I want to see all my workouts when I leave the app and come back later, so that I can keep using the app over time. Now, of course, we could have written these stories in a different way, and certainly different people will come up with different user stories for the same application. But what matters is that we can use user stories to describe exactly what the application will do. And I think that these user stories do a pretty good job on that. Now, in this project, I actually already showed you the working application in the last video, right? But of course, in the real world, you will be building the application from scratch on your own. And so therefore, you will really have to think as if you were the user and put yourself in the user's feet so that you can come up with these user stories and then build your features from there. So let's now actually think about the features. So here on the left side, we have a more boiled down version of the user stories so that we can now work on the features that the application should have. And again, that is based on the user stories. And based on this first user story, we can already imagine a couple of features that our application is going to need. So first, we're going to need a map where the user can click in order to add a new workout. That's because the user wants to log the workout with the location, and so therefore the best way to get the location coordinates is going to be just clicking on a map. Next, since we are working with maps, we should probably use geolocation in order to display the map at the current location of the user, because this is a lot more user-friendly than having the user scroll to their current position, right? So this is a perfect use case for geolocation, and since all browsers on mobile and desktop now support geolocation, this will be a great addition to our application. Then, of course, we're also going to need a form to input the rest of the data. So the distance, the time, pace, and the steps per minute, which is also called cadence. So from the first user story alone, we could already know that we need these three features. I mean, we don't really need them, but they're nice to have because they allow us to satisfy the user story. And so let's now take a look at the second user story. And so for this one, we're going to need a form that is very similar to the first one, but this one has to ask for the elevation gain instead of the steps per minute. Then the user wants to see all the workouts at a glance, and so therefore we're basically just going to have a list with all these workouts. Then the user also wants to see them on a map, and so therefore we will have a feature basically displaying all the workouts on the map as well. And lastly, the last user story basically says that the workouts should of course persist over time. And so there are multiple ways of doing that. And so usually in a real world application, you'll have accounts where people's data then gets stored. But in this case here, since we are just building a very simple application, all we're going to do is to store the workout data right in the browser. And for that, we're going to use a browser API called local storage. Then, whenever the user comes back to the page, we will read the data that was saved in the local storage and then display it both on the map and also on the list. Okay, and so these are the features that we will have to implement. And so let's now put them in our flowchart. Now, the flowchart should of course contain these different features that we're going to implement, but it's also going to contain how the different parts of the app interact with each other, which event makes sense to implement, and also how data flows across the application. So let's now see the first couple of features that we need to implement, and that is geolocation to display the map at the user's location, and then to also display a map where the user can click to add new workouts. And this is how we could put them on the flowchart. But let's actually think together about why we put them like this on the flowchart. So whenever we start to build a flowchart like this, it's a good idea to start with events. And so here in this case, I'm starting with the event of the page loading, basically. And so that's always a good event to start the flowchart, because of course, that's always the first event that basically occurs on any page. I mean, it's not an event that we're gonna handle, but as you know, all the code that is in the top level will essentially be executed when the page loads. And so we can count the page load as an event here as well. So when the page does load, we want to start by getting the user's location coordinates using the geolocation API. So just like we decided on in the last slide, right? Then after that data arrives, we want to then render the map basically centered on the current location of the user. Then we also already saw in the last slide that we need a form to input the data for cycling and for running. So we're going to need to display a form, and basically we will display that form or render that form whenever the user clicks on a certain position on a map. So here in this flowchart, as you see, the yellow parts are the actions and the green parts is basically when we render something on the user interface. And in red, I have marked operations that happen asynchronously. And what that means, we will see in the next video. Now, if the way that I'm building this flowchart here is still confusing to you, then don't worry. So in the future, with more and more practice, you will of course be able to come up with a flowchart like this on your own. So just like everything in coding and programming, this really is a matter of practice. Now just know that in the real world, we usually don't always come up with all the steps in the flowchart right in the planning phase. So it's perfectly okay to just create a rough sketch in the beginning here and then come up with the exact detail during the implementation. So definitely don't get hung up on building the perfect flowchart. Alright, that's just not really necessary in the beginning, and so you should not waste too much time on this. As you become better with practice, this will become easier, and then you might be able to add more and more details to your flowcharts right at the beginning. But when you're just starting out and working on your first applications, then don't stress too much on this. Alright, but anyway, let's continue with our features here. So next up, we want to display workouts in a list and on the map. And so therefore, this is what our flowchart is going to look like. So basically, we rendered the form in step 3 and 4, and then we're going to have an event listener on that form. And so then whenever the user submits a new workout, it is going to be rendered on the map and on the list in steps 5 and 6. Then remember, we want to store this workout data in the browser and then read that data whenever the page reloads. And so what's going to happen here is that also whenever a user creates a new workout, it will store all the workouts in local storage. So using that local storage API in the browser that I just mentioned in the last slide. Then whenever the page loads, as we see here on the left side of the flowchart, then we get all of the workout from local storage and render them on the map and on the list. And of course, that can only happen after the current location has been fetched and the map has been displayed. And so that's essentially what async means. So that red box up there means that it is an operation that takes some time, and only after it's completed, then the rest of the operations that depend on it can be executed. And finally, there is another feature that I didn't mention in the last slide, but which is a nice addition to the way the application works. And so that is to simply move the map to the workout location whenever we click on one of the workouts in the list. And so here in the flowchart, that is also pretty easy to represent. And so basically all we need is an event handler on the list. And then whenever the user clicks on a workout in the list, it will move to that workout's location. All right. And so this is essentially how our application is going to work. And so the features that we need to implement using this flow and this sequence, basically. Now, keep in mind that this flowchart itself actually has nothing to do yet with the implementation itself. So this is just how the program is going to work. And we might very well implement it in some other language. So it wouldn't even have to be JavaScript. So essentially, this is only what our program should do, but not how it does it. So that's more specific, and that's actually for the architecture. And so that brings us to the last part of this planning step, which is, in fact, architecture. Now, just like the flowchart, we don't always need to have the perfect final architecture figured out before implementation. So we can first do some experiments, play around with the code, and only then think about the architecture for the final project in case. Of course, we can do it right in the beginning, but it's not always necessary. And so, to start this project, we will actually simply start coding and starting to implement the features according to the flowchart that we just developed. Then, as we start to need more organization and ways to manage our data, we will come back to thinking about the architecture. All right, and so actually, let's now go do that.